I had so much fun knitting my Toby blanket last year that this year I decided I wanted to revisit the idea and the texture that I used in that blanket, but use them in a different way to create an entirely different design. This blanket I am naming Finley, and in design terms he is Toby's little brother, so he's similar but very different. To knit a blanket like mine, 60 centimeters wide by 80 centimeters long, you are going to need 400 grams of double knit yarn. If you're not from the UK, that is light worsted weight or 3-weight yarn, and the yarn I've used for my sample here is King Cole Cherished in the shade French Navy. You are also going to need some 4mm circular needles that are at least 100 centimeters long. That's just to make sure that they are long enough to accommodate all the stitches that you want to cast on. You will also need some embroidery scissors and the tapestry needle to sort out those ends. And then last but not least, you are going to need 2 stitch markers, and we use these to mark where our side borders start and end. It just makes knitting that textured middle panel so much easier and quicker. The beauty of this blanket is there is no pattern multiple, so there is no set multiple of stitches that you need to cast on. The only thing that you need to remember to do is to cast on an odd number of stitches. For the blanket I showed you in the introduction, I cast on a total of 133 stitches, but you can cast on as many or as little stitches as you like. For this sample, I'm just going to cast on a very small sample of 45 stitches. And for all my blankets, I like to use the long tail cast on method. If you prefer to use a different method, then feel free to do so. This blanket pattern will still work. This blanket is knitted all in one piece from bottom to top. So the first part of the blanket that we need to tackle is that bottom garter stitch edging. That consists of 15 rows worked in exactly the same way. You start by knitting your way all the way along your row until you have just one stitch left on your left hand needle to work. That's our selvage stitch, and we work that in a slightly different way to the rest of the stitches on our row. The type of selvage I like to work for my blankets is to slip this final stitch purlwise with the yarn in front. What that does is give you a really nice neat side edge up the long edges of your blanket, and it looks a little bit like a braid. So the way that we work this stitch is the first thing you want to do is to pop your yarn to the front of your work. I just hold it with my right hand needle, but if you want to lift it to the front of your work, you can do that too. Next, you're going to pop your right hand needle into that stitch from right to left, so as if you were going to purl the stitch. Slide it on all the way so it's firmly onto the right hand needle, and then when it is, you can take your left hand needle out. And then the last thing to do, if you've held your yarn like I have, is to make sure that you lift it round to the front of your work so that you don't accidentally create an extra stitch. That's row 1 of 15 done. I'll now leave you to go away and to knit the next 14 rows in exactly the same way so that you've worked a total of 15, and I will rejoin you at the point that we are ready to start our middle textured panel, and this is the section that will form the bulk of your blanket. Now that we've finished that first bottom garter stitch border, it's time to move on to that middle textured panel. This is made up of 14 rows that you will repeat in blocks over and over to build length to your blanket. I'm going to go over all 14 rows one by one, and then I'll leave you to carry on repeating them as many times as you need to build the rest of the length on your blanket. The first time we work row 1, we're going to do a bit of setup work just to get our stitch markers into place, but every time that you work row 1 after the first time, you are just going to slip your markers instead of placing them. Start row 1 by knitting the first 9 stitches. After those 9 stitches, you are going to grab the first of your 2 stitch markers and you're just going to pop it onto your right hand needle. That marks the side border on the right hand side of your blanket. Then you want to carry on and knit your way across until 9 stitches before the end of the row. That will be when you have 9 stitches left on this left hand needle to work before the end of the row. At this point, you're going to grab the second of your 2 stitch markers, and just like we did at the other end of the row, you are going to pop it onto your right hand needle, and then you want to carry on and knit the next 8 stitches. Finish your row by slipping that final stitch purlwise with the yarn in front. Row 2, you want to start by knitting until you hit the first stitch marker, and that should be after 9 stitches. Slip your marker over from your left needle to your right needle, and then you want to carry on and purl all the way across until you hit your second marker. When you reach your second marker, you are going to slip it over from your left needle to your right needle, and then you want to carry on and knit 8 stitches. Finish off your row by slipping that final stitch purlwise with the yarn in front. Row 3 is really nice and simple. You just want to knit your way all the way across, and you're going to knit every single stitch with the exception of that final stitch. You're going to carry on working that final stitch in the same way as you have done for every row so far, and you're going to slip it purlwise with the yarn in front. And don't forget, when you hit your stitch markers, to slip them over from one needle to the other and to not accidentally let them drop off your needles. Row 4, you want to start by knitting every stitch until you hit your first stitch marker. Slip your stitch marker over from your left needle to your right needle, and then just like with row 2, you want to purl all the way across until you hit your second marker. Slip that second marker over from your left needle to your right needle, and then knit the next 8 stitches. Slip that final stitch purlwise with the yarn in front. Row 5, another nice and easy one. You're going to knit your way all the way across until that very last stitch. Slip your markers over as you come to them, and then for the final stitch of the row, you just want to slip it purlwise with the yarn in front. Row 6 is the first row to add texture to our work, and like our other rows, you are going to start by knitting until you hit that first stitch marker. Slip the marker over, and then you want to purl the next 4 stitches. Then knit 1 stitch. Now we are going to work a 2-stitch repeat until 4 stitches before this second marker. That 2-stitch repeat is nice and simple. You are going to purl 1 stitch and then knit 1 stitch, and you want to repeat those 2 stitches until 4 stitches before the marker, and that should come after a knit 1. So you're going to work purl 1, knit 1 until 4 stitches before your second marker. These final 4 stitches before the second marker, you are going to purl. Slip your second marker over and knit the next 8 stitches. Finish your row by slipping that final stitch purlwise with the yarn in front. Row 7, start as always by knitting the stitches before your stitch marker. Slip that marker over, and then you want to knit the next 5 stitches. Now, just like with the previous row, you are going to work a 2-stitch repeat until 4 stitches before the second marker, and that 2-stitch repeat is as follows. You are going to purl 1 and then knit 1. So purl 1, knit 1 until 4 stitches before the second marker, and that should come after you've worked a knit 1. These last 4 stitches before your second marker, you are going to knit. Slip that marker over and then carry on and knit the next 8 stitches. Finish your row by slipping that final stitch purlwise with the yarn in front. Row 8 starts by knitting until you hit that first stitch marker. Slip the marker over and then purl the next 4 stitches. Then you're going to knit 1 stitch, and now, just like with row 6, we are going to jump into a 2-stitch repeat that you are going to work until you have 4 stitches left to go before your second marker. And that 2-stitch repeat is purl 1 and then knit 1. So purl 1, knit 1, all the way across until 4 stitches before your second marker, and you should hit that point after a knit 1. These 4 stitches before your second marker you want to purl. Slip that second marker over and then knit the next 8 stitches. Finish off the row by slipping that final stitch purlwise with the yarn in front. Row 9 is another one of those nice easy rows where you are just going to knit all the way across. You're going to slip your stitch markers as you come across them, and then for your final stitch of the row, don't forget that's your selvage stitch, and you want to slip that purlwise with the yarn in front. Row 10, start by knitting until you hit that first stitch marker. Slip that first stitch marker over, and then you are going to purl all the stitches in between the 2 stitch markers. So you want to purl your way across until you hit that second stitch marker. Slip that second marker over as you come to it, and then you want to carry on and knit the next 8 stitches. Finish off your row by slipping that final stitch purlwise with the yarn in front. Row 11, nice and simple, you are going to knit every single stitch with the exception of that very final stitch. That stitch is our selvage stitch, so you want to slip that purlwise with the yarn in front, and then don't forget to slip your stitch markers over as you hit them. But apart from that final stitch, every stitch in row 11 is a knit stitch. Row 12 starts by knitting the 9 stitches before that first stitch marker. Slip the first marker over from your left needle to your right needle, and then you are going to purl all the stitches in between the 2 markers. So you are going to purl your way across until you hit that second marker. Slip the second marker over and then knit the next 8 stitches. That should leave you with just your selvage stitch to work, and you are going to slip that purlwise with the yarn in front. For row 13, you are going to knit all the way across with the exception of that final stitch. You are going to slip your stitch markers over from one needle to the next as you hit them, and then for the final stitch of the row, don't forget that you want to slip that purlwise with the yarn in front. Row 14 is the final row of our repeat, and just like our other rows, you are going to start off by knitting until you hit that very first stitch marker. Slip the marker over from your left needle to your right needle, and then you want to purl the next 4 stitches. After those 4 stitches, you are going to knit your way across until 4 stitches before your second marker. Just like at the other end of the row, when you get to the 4 stitches before your marker, you want to purl them. So you are going to purl 4. Slip that second marker over and then knit the next 8 stitches. Finish off your row by slipping that final selvage stitch purlwise with the yarn in front. So that's our 14 row repeat done, and these are the 14 rows that you are going to use as the building blocks for your blanket. So after row 14 you would return back to row 1 and start the process again as many times as you need to until your project is about 10 centimeters shorter than you want your final overall length of your blanket to be. At that point, so that we get symmetry top and bottom, you are going to work rows 1 to 13 once more, so you leave off that final row, and once you've done that you can come back and I will show you how to work that top garter stitch border. So that you get a good idea of what your project should look like, I will go away and work rows 1 to 13 here myself, and then we will move on to the garter stitch border together. Your project will obviously be a lot bigger than mine, but you can see the effect that working rows 1 to 13 once more gives you. It just gives you symmetry top and bottom of your blanket and leaves you in the perfect position to start your top garter stitch border. Just like our bottom garter stitch border, the top border consists of 15 rows worked in exactly the same way. The first of those 15 rows should be a wrong side row, so the wrong side of your blanket should be facing you. And just like with that bottom garter stitch border, you are going to knit every single stitch with the exception of that final stitch in the row. That's our selvage stitch. In this row, the first time you work it, when you hit your stitch markers, you can actually remove them rather than slipping them over, because we don't need to mark our side borders anymore. So you are going to knit your way across until you hit that very last stitch, and then just like we have been doing for the rest of the project, you're going to slip that final stitch purlwise with the yarn in front. So that's the first of our border rows done, and I will leave you to carry on and work the next 14 rows by yourself, and I'll rejoin you just as we're about to start our cast off and get this project off our needles and into a finished blanket. The last row of any blanket project is your cast off, and for my blankets I like to use a really basic knitted cast off. This gives a really nice smooth and sturdy top edge to your blanket that replicates pretty much what the cast on feels like. In this video I'm just going to go over the first few stitches, but if you need a more in-depth tutorial then I do have one on my channel that I will link for you now. Your cast off row starts by knitting the first 2 stitches. When you're casting off, you want to keep your tension on your stitches quite nice and relaxed, because if you don't, your blanket won't lay flat. Your stitches will pull in with the tightness of your tension. Once you've knitted these 2 stitches, you're going to grab this left hand needle and pop it into your stitch from left through to right, the first of the 2 stitches that you knitted. Then you are going to lift this stitch up and over the second stitch on your needle. You might want to pop your finger just to hold everything secure so that one doesn't slip off too. And then you're going to lift it all the way up, over and completely off that right hand needle, and you should have gone from 2 stitches on this needle down to 1. Next you are going to knit 1 more stitch and then repeat that process again. Lift the first stitch on the needle up and over the second and completely off that right hand needle, and you're going to repeat that process of knitting 1 and lifting 1 all the way along your row until you have 1 stitch left on this right hand needle and no stitches left on this left hand needle. Once you reach this final stitch of your row and you have no stitches left on your left hand needle, you can break your yarn. You want to leave a tail that is long enough for you to be able to sew your end in comfortably. Anything from about 20 to 25 centimeters will do. And then with this final stitch, what I like to do just to secure it is to lift so that the stitch is bigger and then take the needle out. We don't need that anymore. Then I put my finger and thumb through the loop that stitch has created and pull my yarn tail through the loop. Then I pull the tail to tighten everything up and pull so that that loop goes really nice and tiny, and that gives you a nice secure base for you to be able to sew your tail into. A couple of final bits and bobs before I leave you to your knitting. Finley is not a reversible design, so if I show you the back, you can see that the back of the work does not look the same as the front. It's still nice and neat, but it just doesn't have that same defined pattern that the front of your work does. If you would like to have some written instructions to follow along to, then I do have a free pattern on my blog, and you can also buy an ad-free PDF if you are the sort of person that would prefer to have something to print out and take away with you rather than looking at a screen while you're knitting. And last but not least, I always like to leave you with another pattern to be inspired by, and in this case I'm going to leave you with Toby, the blanket that inspired me to make Finley.